Welcome to the Rebranding Christianity podcast, a space for those who care about Jesus' message of love and grace and selflessness, but are concerned that contemporary American Christianity has gone way off brand. In John 13, Jesus told us what the Jesus follower brand is supposed to be. It's love, radical love. It's loving others the way Jesus loved us. That's how a watching world are to know who Jesus' disciples are. According to Jesus, love is the Christian's brand identifier. Today, however, Christians may be known for a lot of different things, but unfortunately, all too often, love isn't one of them. Our hope is that American Christianity can begin to reclaim what Jesus intended Christianity to be. We believe that it's time for a rebrand. I'm Greg Holmes.
And I'm Cindy Park. In the first season of this podcast, we talk with Jeff Jones and Mike Hogan, authors of the book that launched this podcast, Rebranding Christianity, When the World's Most Important Brand Loses Its Way. That was a good place to start, but we have all been eagerly anticipating broadening the conversation and including other voices. The truth is, we're not the only ones who are saying these things. There are many Christians, many Christian leaders and pastors, as well as academics and thought leaders who would like to see a more loving, gracious, and authentic expression of Christianity flourish in our generation. We're going to hear from many of those folks this season. Jeff, who are we going to hear from today?
Well, today we get to hear from one of the co-authors, Dwight Jewson, who will give his credentials a little bit in terms of his branding background and where he's coming from spiritually. But for me, he's one of those trajectory changing people in my life. It's just like every time you have a conversation with him, there's insight, and he knows how to ask the right questions too that cause you to go down a trail you never would have gone down. And boy, are you glad you did. And I'm not even sure he knows. He might know where the trail should lead. I never know. But he just launches you on this path of exploration that it's with the right questions that is going to lead to a good place. And I so appreciate that about him. And he also, you can count on him to be honest and not in a mean way, honest in an empowering way of making you deal with reality. And I don't really like reality that much, right? I like the way I want things to be, not the way things are sometimes. So he's great also at sort of making me deal with reality. And then, yeah, of course, you can move somewhere once you understand reality, then you can actually move to somewhere better. But so you're going to feel that in this conversation, both the insight and the questions and the honesty, and it's going to take you somewhere that you thought, man, I never thought I'd end up there, but I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, you and Mike had the opportunity to talk with Dwight Jewson, and it was such a rich conversation. We're actually going to do two podcasts. We're going to kind of break up the interview and do this podcast as well as the next one. And we're going to jump here in just a second. But before we do, Mike, I want to ask you just a couple of questions about Dwight because you've known him the longest. And the first, I think that people who are listening, who are just going to get to know Dwight Jewson for the first time through these podcasts, are probably going to be asking themselves these questions too. The first one is, how in the world did we get this guy? He has such a unique skill set, and that he brings to this and experience. And second, Mike calls himself a nun, like N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, that like meaning no religious affiliation, which means he doesn't have a dog in this race, as far as the Christian brand. But so why is he interested in a healthy brand of Christianity flourishing? So it's I think a lot of people are going to be asking those questions.
Sure. So first of all, Dwight and I have known each other more than 25 years, and we worked together a lot. And he's always been a person that, like Jeff, I respect him deeply, and he's been impactful in my life, and just a person who's great to process the big questions of life with. And as we've done that together, I think what we found is, we have more in common, right, than we have that's different. And that's why he's been a part of this conversation. But in terms of his involvement here, I think you kind of have to go back to why Dwight left church in the first place. And he'll cover this, I'm sure, in the interview. But, he actually grew up, it would surprise people to know he grew up in the church, and he left what would now be, say, 50 years ago. 50 years ago, I'm sure he wouldn't have articulated it quite this clearly, but essentially left the church because he saw the church as kind of pursuing power for its own ends, right? Instead of demonstrating unconditional love and serving those it was called to serve, which sounds kind of funny because that's 50 years ago and that's what we're talking about today.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty interesting to me. It's fascinating to me also because it's a great example of something else we talked about, which is how, in a lot of ways, people outside the church can see this much more clearly than people inside the church.
Right. Yeah.
And you see this if you've ever worked with a company that has brands. Sometimes the brand group is the last ones to know, right? Because they don't want to hear it. Right? and then finally, I think they're actually rooting for. It's funny. Why would somebody who's outside the church be rooting for the church to be successful? Mm-hmm. And it's because he's also a student of the culture, right? And he sees that one of the deepest needs. You hire a guy who's not in the church, and he says one of the deepest needs in society today is for somebody to do that, which is exactly what the church should be doing, but by the way, it's not doing. Which kind of sounds like the last page of a brand consulting project, right?
Okay, let's jump in. We're going to join the conversation just as Mike begins to introduce Dwight Jewson.
First of all, Dwight, thanks so much for taking the time. Thanks for everything, including the involvement in the book, but thanks for being here today. So Dwight is a great personal friend of mine and a longtime mentor of mine, but he also happens to be one of the top brand gurus in the country. And I hope you'll forgive me for calling you a guru. Dwight formed a company over 30 years ago called Strategic Frameworking. And it's a brand consultancy whose longtime client base is pretty much a who's who of corporate America. Some of the companies there would be, Frito-Lay, GameStop, PepsiCo, Tropicana, General Mills, Johnson & Johnson, T-Mobile, Citibank, Microsoft, and so on. He also, however, has dabbled a little bit in the political realm, playing a key role on campaigns for Ed Koch, for Jay Rockefeller, and Hillary Clinton when she was running for Senate. You may have figured out by now from that last part that occasionally Dwight and I find ourselves sitting on different sides of the aisle politically. We also, frankly, in terms of church affiliation, sometimes find ourselves sitting on different sides of the aisle. And that's, I think, really some interesting points there that we want to delve into a little bit more in this conversation. So, Dwight, if I could start, first question for you. Tell us a little bit about, why you were ultimately chose to become a part of creating this book. And, I'd love for you to go sort of all the way back to the beginning, because I know at the beginning, you weren't even sure that you wanted to work with at Chase Oaks Church. And tell us about that. And so your sort of personal journey there, becoming interested in this book project.
Thank you, Mike. Hi, Jeff.
Hey there.
Just a little bit, and I won't make it long on my background. I grew up in a large urban Methodist church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was active in that church. In high school, I was the president of the Methodist Youth Fellowship. And I went to college thinking, maybe I'm going to be a minister. So my bachelor's degree is actually in theology. And it included studies in both the U.S. and I spent a year at the University of Durham in England with, at that point, some would argue the premier theological faculty in the world. So, I would classify myself today as a strongly spiritual leaning nun. I think there's a difference there between there's probably shades of nuns, if you will. So I have a deep spiritual connection that's largely informed by a Christian legacy, but I have been distraught my whole lifetime by what happens to this power of the Spirit in the institutional form of the church. Connection to Spirit risks becoming lost as the church becomes an institution and has other priorities and tasks that it can take on. And when that happens and the clarity of the church's task about connection to Spirit becomes lost and it becomes engaged in politics or social issues of the day or any number of other agendas, doesn't much matter what they are. I've had trouble with that my whole life. When I was I just started college, the church that I was a member of wanted to get funds to celebrate its 100th anniversary. Fine, well, laudable kind of cause, but to find the funds, the minister of pastoral care, a wonderful PhD clinician who gave wonderful care to the church, was decided that it was more important to spend the money on that celebration than it was on continuing that ministry. And I actually broke with the church at that point. I was deeply concerned about that happening. So when I talk about this issue of distraught, what happens when church becomes an institution and has other priorities than the connection to Spirit, has been a lifelong kind of issue for me. And I'll just point out, by the way, for all of you know these things, from Nicaea to the Crusades to the papal indulgences in the 14th century to Christian nationalism today, this issue, I'm not the first person to wrestle with it in life. It's a long issue. And I'll also say, by the way, that I am deeply influenced by Augustine, who talked about sin as separation from Spirit. Not so much the act that you involved in, that's a symptom of the separation. And that issue of churches becoming separated from Spirit has always been a lifelong concern to me. So in 2002, when Mike contacted me and asked me, hey, would I have a conversation with Chase Oaks Church? And I had some sense of Chase Oaks being a fairly conservative evangelical church at that point. I was reluctant and concerned. And I said to Mike clearly, hey, Mike, theologically and politically, we're in very different places. So, of course, I will meet with them, but I have real boundaries. And at the point where those boundaries are pushed beyond what I can ethically be comfortable with, I'm going to say so and politely leave. So 2002, I believe it was, I first met with the church, and I was delighted. We had a good, long, pointed conversation, as we did once or twice a year since then, on through the early 2000s. While I held my boundaries theologically and politically, I found a receptive, listening conversation, which I appreciated in that time. Then in 2009, Mike, I flew to Dallas intending to have dinner with you. I got a note on my phone that plans had changed, and would I be willing to have dinner with just Jeff alone? And Jeff and I had never had that before. I looked at where, and it was a good steakhouse in Dallas, and I said, well, what the heck, of course I will. And I got to the meal. There was Jeff at this nice restaurant, and there was a bottle of wine on the table. And I got a sense, gee, maybe this is going to be a little different conversation than we've had in the past. I'll be interested to see. And I sat down, and Jeff, this is my memory of the conversation. You'll correct me if you have a different one. And you looked at me and said, well, Dwight, you were right. And I smiled and said, that's wonderful, Jeff. What was I right about? And he said, we've been using our power on behalf of the powerful, not the powerless. That's not what Jesus had in mind, was it? And candidly, I was stunned, and happily stunned, because I couldn't more deeply agree. And that opened up a conversation between us, which this book is a continuing, in my engagement in it, is a continuing part of the journey in. Well, and thank you. I'll go on and expand about that in a bit, but that I think that lead up is important.
Well, it's been quite a journey and a wonderful one. So thank you for speaking of the life, not only of our church, but another way you impacted me. And I don't even know if you remember this, but what I was really talking to you about at first was how could we, I don't know if I used this terminology back then, but rebrand Christianity in our own community. To repair the reputation of Christianity in our own community with those we're trying to reach outside of ourselves. And you're the one, and again, I don't know if you remember this or not, you said, why are we just thinking about, your community? Why thinking just Dallas? Why not think the country? Why not think, bigger than that? And I thought, well, okay, we can, and that shifted, that really also helped sort of steer this conversation bigger. We're not the only voice talking nationally, but we're certainly one of them because of that. And that eventuated into, deciding to write a book and be part of the project. And were you surprised that you ended up being a co-author of an evangelical Christian book?
Well, obviously that was a decision on my part. Let me talk about that decision and why, right? And I'm going to take as my text for that, if you will, your comment. We've been using our power on behalf of the powerless, powerful, not the powerless. That's not what Jesus had in mind. There's power. Power is different things. There's secular power, military or political, and there's moral and spiritual power. I strongly believe that we have a moral or spiritual power void that needs filling, serious kind of filling. But that spiritual power is very different from secular power, military power, political power. And churches, and most notably the evangelical church, has amassed considerable secular power. I'm always, and I'll talk about this later on in our conversation, I'm sure, but 24% of U.S. adults today describe themselves as born again or evangelical Protestants. Now that number is down 6% since 2007, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too. 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016. He only won by 77,000 votes. You don't need to do much math to say that if 80% of 24% of adults, that's a pretty big block in terms of it. And by the way, what's so interesting is that 80% was the same number in 2020 and 2022, and is pretty much the polling number today. There's no question, and I imagine many of the people who'll be listening to this will have trouble with what I'm about to say, but that from my personal point of view, Donald Trump and Roger Ailes and others have used Christianity as a vehicle to amass personal power. I'm sorry, I'm just not buying the authenticity of that, and can't. But I would argue that evangelical churches have confused political power and moral spiritual power. And the decline of religious affiliation is a symptom of that confusion. Okay. In the 90s, 90% of Americans identified as Christians. 10 years ago, 75% Americans identified as Christians. That number is now down 12 points since 10 years ago and nearly 30 points since the 60s. So, and the biggest drop in that has been millennials, people born between 1981 and 1996. Less than half of them now identify as Christians. You can have various points of view on that data. My point of view is it's a symptom of something missing in their lives. I think something missing in the evangelical church. So my involvement with the book and desire is to join into what I think is in such a deeply important conversation in our country and our world today about, well, what does spiritual power look like? What is its voice, and how does it speak to the what I am terming the spiritual void that we're up against?
Hey, Dwight, building kind of on that, you're obviously a branding expert. You spent most of your career helping to build brands, giving advice to brands. You and I worked together on some very big brands, and I know that in the book, there's a quote from you, something about, if evangelicalism was my client, blah, blah, blah. And I want to kind of pose that here for the podcast, right? If American evangelicalism, whoever the epicenter of that is, came and hired you and said, okay, Dwight, tell us what to do. What's your prescription?
Well, I'll start with the book, and then I'll go to the broader quote prescription. We all know the old thing about the canary in the coal mine. You put that canary down there. Are there gases down there? Can it live? And if it is, you're worried about it. It's my hope that the book can be part of the reverse canary in the coal mine, a platform for evangelicals and other people who are not finding and are not comfortable with the direction of so much, and what I talk about, the loss of the spiritual. And I know that many people would say, "What do you mean the loss of the spiritual?" But I do think it has become so much of that lost in the political and secular power out there, and hoping that platform can make a real difference in the conversation, not only in evangelical churches but in America. Keeping in mind that evangelical Christians are a quarter of our population, and a very powerful quarter. But Mike, to directly answer your question, I'd start a conversation like I would any other brand, which is, what is the job that you take up on behalf of America and our world? And I'd say right away, it ain't politics and it ain't military power. It ain't secular power. Where's your authority? What do you do that no one else can do? And what are the unmet needs that are out there and only you can address? And it wouldn't take me long to get to the bottom line answer to those questions from my point of view, which is grace. The power of Christianity, of evangelical Christianity, any flavor you want to talk about is grace and what it means. And so if that's where your power is, if that's where your authority is, then the question is, are you living from that? And it's so easy, it always has been easy for churches to say, well, living from that means to take up secular political power. I don't believe that. I believe living from that means to live that. To be that in the world. And so the kind of radical love and grace that Jeff talks about so well in the book is the prescription. I don't know any other. Just one other part of answering that question for me, Mike, is brands are about identity. I once said to somebody that if you wanted to know who somebody was, go to the bar and look at what kind of beer they're drinking, because the label of that beer says a lot about who they are. Am I a Budweiser guy? Am I a Corona guy? Am I a whatever? I worry that the identity of, at least the outward identity for so many people, has been two roles that I find very problematic. One is the role of victim, right? And I want to say to evangelical Christians who talk about themselves as victims today, hey, what was the line of "You're no Jack Kennedy" in the political dialogue a few years ago? You're no first century evangelical Christian, right? Those guys were victims, right? They didn't have power. The whole Christian message was about community and grace, and it wasn't a role of victim. And the second role that I'm concerned about, that so many take on, is being the evangelical police. Our job is to regulate morality and quote, arrest bad morality. I think there's a different identity out there in the Christian heritage and tradition, which is far more powerful, and that is loaded with grace and gratitude and warmth and caring, all things that we're deeply missing in our world. So what would my advice be? Grace and grace and grace.
So Dwight, this is kind of a bonus question, follow up from that. As you work with brands, some of them have had really great brand propositions, brand promises, and you probably see them stray from there and think, why in the world would you stray from that? But it seems like if Christianity was your, customer, it has to be, from your perspective, I would think, really strange that Christianity was something as powerful as grace, as potent, as unique, at all that, as like you said, what the world needs. How in the world would you depart from that? Like, why in the world would you slip from that? It has to be just confounding, I would think. And
it's deeply confounding, and you're right. I can't tell you all the brands I've worked on where we've gotten it right, gotten them to their core, and then watched them drift off that message over time. And it's not just about message, it's about everything they do and how they live. But, we're in a world that's desperate for grace, desperate for a more fulfilling, more rounded way of living and life. What Christianity offers is that mystery, potent mystery of grace. That's where all the power is. And stay with that, because the cup of that in our beverage diet in America, if you will, is pretty empty. We need a lot of that. I'm overtly arguing that other agendas, political agendas of all stripes, are simply distractions from that. There's a lot of people who can talk to me about those kind of issues. That's not your secret sauce as an institution. Your secret sauce is the irrefutable mystery of grace.
Okay, So Dwight did not come to mess around during the interview. He was really forthright and bold about his beliefs. And Mike, as you said during the episode, you and he have some different views. Why have you chosen to be in close friendship and relationship with someone who has such different views from you? How does it make you better?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I think it's just good practice overall. But I would say, I actually like smart people. And I really like really smart people. And so, with Dwight, he's just a wonderful person to discuss with, always has something insightful to say. He hasn't been afraid to challenge me in my life. And I could give a couple of examples, either personally or professionally, where and Jeff alluded to this earlier, his way of asking questions. I don't mean it like he has a particular thing that he wants me to do. I mean, he just asked a penetrating question. And, you're either going to be open to that or not. But I think if you're open to that, you end up at a better place. And because of that, I've learned a lot from him. And he and I have found ourselves in so many cases where we're discussing pretty much anything you can imagine. And we'll almost always end up saying there's more we agree on than we disagree on. And I think we're going to the, whether it be political thing, we almost always agree on here's what I think the problem is, here's what I'd like the result to be. What we might disagree on is how to go about it.
Right. I think especially where we ended there in that conversation where he's talking about the secret sauce, I think that was a great example of what you said, and the setup on how sometimes an outside perspective can be a whole lot clearer. And it seems like he has a pretty clear perspective on the value that the church can bring, and it is probably pretty frustrating that we seem to be missing it for him.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what the other thing he said, I think, is the number of times, if you take this out of a church context, right, the number of times that he's worked or I've worked with a brand, and, rarely are you going into a brand and saying, let's find something completely new. Almost always what you're doing is saying, okay, here's what the brand is really about. Here's why it's powerful. How in the world did you get from there to what you're doing today? Right. And getting him back on track. And so for him, this is something that he's done a million times.
Jeff, what were your thoughts as you maybe listen to that conversation?
Well, it's fascinating to hear somebody who is a nun talk about our brand promise and the core brand, the grace, which it is, right? That's the gospel. It's the good news of the gospel. It's grace. That is what makes Christianity unique. It's what makes it. Not every other religion in the world is about works and what you do and morality. And Christianity is not that. It's all centered around grace and demonstrating that grace as we have good news to share by being good news. It's just fascinating me to hear somebody looking from the outside in, just saying, okay, you've got the most powerful thing in the world there that our world desperately needs, and why in the world are you doing anything else? And so that, I think it's certainly energizing for me to say, man, let's not slip. Let's just be on brand and be on focus, because it is, and the early church illustrated that it becomes an irresistible force for good in the world when you actually are on brand. And so why wouldn't we be?
So I have a follow-up question for you. Since you've been in church leadership and Christian leadership for so long, if that is our secret sauce, if grace is the secret sauce of the church and of Christianity, how easy or difficult is it to remain focused on that and say no to everything else?
Yeah, so hard, and that's what leadership is staying focused on the most important thing and on the thing that we're asked to do. It's the gospel, the good news of the gospel, grace, that is the core of Christianity. But I kind of see it as sort of a rubber band is the image I always think of in leadership, that there's this, it is not natural. The way of grace is not natural. It's supernatural. But in our humanity, it just doesn't make any sense, and religion will drift away from grace by nature, and churches will become internally focused and get distracted by morality or legislating morality and culture, or the trappings of religion, or the preferences of their own people, or politics, or whatever it is that we get distracted by. It's been that way from the very beginning. I mean, it's the story of church history. It's the story of religion when Jesus came and he's frustrated with the Pharisees because they've actually missed the whole point. And so as a leader, the way I think about it is it's like there's this rubber band that is always working to snap us back away from grace to all this other stuff. And we just got to keep resisting that. And the minute that you don't, you're just going to find yourself distracted by religion and culture wars and legislating morality, or you will always snap back to an internal focus, not an external focus. And so that's the role of leadership, is just to keep making sure that, hey, we just keep staying on target, we keep staying on brand, we remember that the gospel is everything. It's all we have, and it's the most powerful thing in the universe. And so let's do that.
Yeah. So it seems like, Jeff, then, that part of that core message is really understanding and experiencing God's love for us. That's what helps me to really extend grace to other people. And that reminds me of a message you gave recently and a story that you told about your granddaughter. And that really, it made me teary to listen to that story and just the way you tied it in. And I've been in Jesus' Love for like over 40 years, and I'm still struck by that concept of God's love for me. So can you just expand on that a little bit and tell us, like, how does that impact us to experience God's love for us in a deeply personal way? Yeah.
So the story is, I have I have two granddaughters, but only one can talk because one is little baby, and the other, Eden, is 3. And so the story is about Eden, and we were with her over the holidays, over Thanksgiving, and it was so fun to hear her a couple times as she was playing. I just heard her under her breath. She would think about Christy and me, my wife and I, who she calls Lolly and Pops.
Your Pops.
I'm
Lolly.
Pops. Yeah, she's Lolly. Right. And Eden just say to herself, Lolly and Pops. She just thought about us, and she said, they love me so much. And then another time, Lolly and Pops, they love me so much. And then multiple times she'll say that, like Colin didn't want to give her a donut, and she was like, well, Lolly and Pops will, because they love me so much, right? And so just that, Lolly and Pops love me so much. And you could tell she was just, it was just natural to her. It was the oxygen she was breathing, this unconditional love that she felt. And I hope she always feels that from Lolly and Pops. But how powerful, and I believe it's what God wants for us, if we thought of God that way, if his unconditional love for us, that, because we don't love Eden because she's perfect. She's not. She's awesome, but she's not perfect, and she'll get more imperfect over time, probably, right? I mean, as she gets older and makes bigger mistakes, but it won't affect our love for her. Same way with God, with us, and that's grace, right? That's unconditional love. Of if we could just sort of walk around with this realization of God loves me so much, and that's what God wants, and that's what He wants us to display to other people. And so I think you're right. What you just said is that until we've received God's grace and understood his unconditional love, it's really difficult then to, sort of pour out what you don't already have. If you're not full, how do you pour that out to other people? And so I do think really important if we're going to relate in a world like this with unconditional love and grace, that we open our lives to God and stay in God's presence and stay close to Him and experience that ourselves, so then it just overflows out of us. Because otherwise we'll run out of steam. We can't just we can't just manufacture that kind of unconditional love and grace on our own. It's what God does in us that then pours out to other people.
And remember just how powerful, once we experience that, we can then forget how powerful love and grace is in our life, and we start thinking about other things. But to go back and remember kind of what God has done for us and the love we've been changed because of love and grace.
Yeah.
And I love the phrase that Dwight uses of secret sauce, because it puts in my mind that we have something that love and grace is. It's not just something that kind of heals the world. It is something that satisfies, that people actually want, and that if it is this, value proposition that the church has, that the gospel has, that grace is our secret sauce, it does. And this is convicting for me, because I've been in church leadership for a long, long time too, and been a part of a lot of initiatives and a lot of different types of things. But it does kind of bring me back to the question that if what we're doing isn't flavored like significantly with the secret sauce, then we need to ask some really hard questions whether we should be doing it at all. There are a lot of things that we could be doing, but we have one secret sauce, and it's so, just as Jeff said, it is so easy to get pulled into so many different directions. But all right, we're going to stop there, and we're going to come back at our next podcast and pick up the second half of the conversation with Dwight. It's really fascinating. Can't wait to jump in and hear y'all's response to that. And thank you, everyone who's listening right now. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and hope you can catch us this next time, the next episode, as we continue to rebrand Christianity together.